Hello, this is News for Scotland. I'm Hugh, and in this final part of our mini-series on the parties standing in Scotland, we're going to look at SNP and Labour. It makes sense to put them together because if one's up, the other's down, because really they are the big two in Scottish politics. It's a two-horse race here. Might be a two-horse race in England between Labour and Conservatives. Here it's between Labour and SNP. No other party really matters. The Lib Dems and the Conservatives may get 4 or 5 MPs, and Alba are still fighting to keep Neil Hanvey's seats in Kirkcaldy, and Kenny McCaskill is fighting a safe Grangemouth oil refinery campaign. But the main question is which party can reach the finishing line of 29 MPs for Scotland. So let's look at what the parties are offering, starting with the challenger, Labour. UK-wide, of course, Labour expect that Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister by the 5th of July. Opinion polls all year have shown the Tories losing support. They began this campaign 20 points behind Labour, and they haven't made that up. In fact, it's quite likely that they have fallen even further since the campaign started. And the election's just 2 weeks away, less than 2 weeks away now. No sign of any upturn in the fortunes of Tories as of today. Looking at Labour, change is the buzzword you hear most often from Labour campaigners. The Conservatives, after all, have run the UK government since May 2010, and voters south of the border have had enough of austerity, the cost of living crisis, not to mention sleaze. But what kind of change will Labour deliver? On economic policy, no change appears likely. In fact, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, is a mainstream Conservative economist, having worked for HBOS and for the Bank of England. She was quoted in the Financial Times last autumn insisting that no change really could summarise her position. That was my words, not hers. But she did say it was a Labour government that gave the Bank of England its independence, and I will protect it. It was a Conservative Chancellor who established the Office for Budget Responsibilities, and I will strengthen it. So no change there. She went on to promise we will guarantee in law that any government making significant permanent tax and spending changes will be subject to an independent forecast of its impact from the OBR. Politically, that statement was presumably an attack on Liz Truss and her disastrous few weeks in number 10 last year, but it does show that Labour under Starmer and Reeves will put a balanced budget above any need to increase public spending. Labour will in fact promise better public services, but has limited means of paying for it if borrowing is ruled out. The gamble is, of course, on economic growth, which Sir Keir Starmer has promised, but does Labour know any more than the Tories on how to deliver it? As you can see, growth has indeed been poor in Britain during the Tory years and for the last 15 or 20 years. Although it's a way down during COVID and then way back up again, it does look like the trend is down for those last few years, doesn't it? So the traditional way to boost growth is to boost spending, put money into people's pockets, or invest in large-scale public sector projects, borrowing to pay for it if you need to. In the UK, for example, that could mean an emergency housing programme, and that's needed, or installing better insulation or green energy systems, or building a modern high-speed train network. That's not going to happen, is it? So that would be change, but don't expect that from a cautious Labour administration. So what does Labour offer Scottish voters specifically? Surely the biggest advantage is that they will most likely be part of the Starmer government from June 5 onwards. So unlike the SNP, Anna Starmer can argue that he will have a voice at the heart of the UK government. This angle, maximising Scotland's influence, also extends to the international connections for Scottish exporters through being in the UK. Starmer promises to leverage the UK's global trade networks to promote Scottish businesses abroad. Great, who could argue with that? But aren't they doing that anyway? In the Scottish Labour manifesto, they make a virtue out of Reeves' safety-first approach to the economy. Tough spending rules apparently are the way to grow the economy. Is that right? At least that policy does mean stability, which could mean bringing down inflation. Well, it is coming down anyway, but also maybe bringing down interest rates and keeping mortgages low. Labour, however, does make spending promises. They offer NHS investment, enough to fund 160,000 additional medical appointments per year, but they aim to pay for this by cutting out tax loopholes. Specifically, Labour promises to end non-dom tax status. This means UK residents who claim a permanent home outside the UK are not liable to pay any tax here. Time that was ended, say Labour. But will this bring in enough to pay for all those promises? We aren't so sure. Earlier this year, UK Labour estimated this measure could bring in around 5 billion quid. Now that's a whole UK figure, so unless they're going to give that all to us in Scotland, which I think is unlikely, we assume that Scotland's share would be about 10% of that, something like 500 million. Now that indeed would be a handy sum to give to the SNP government in Edinburgh, but it's not really all that much out of a total Scottish budget of 60 billion, that's 60,000 million. Labour's other big promise here, of course, is GB Energy headquartered in Scotland. Here's what Labour say. GB Energy will be a publicly owned clean power company headquartered in Scotland to cut bills for good and boost energy security, paid for by a windfall tax on oil and gas giants. Again, voters will ask, can this new company do all that? Already, Sir Keir Starmer has had to admit on Radio Scotland that it's not actually an energy company at all. It's an investment vehicle, and that was his words. And this investment vehicle is aimed at attracting private capital investment into the new green energy sector. Not a bad thing to do, of course, but it won't be a publicly owned corporation either. The government may take a share of something like 25% in the capital. So unless Labour promised to do something about a distorted energy retail pricing system, GB Energy won't have any effect on your household bills either. These limitations haven't stopped Labour campaigners making great claims about GB Energy. So like the non-dom policy, I suppose it's all down to credibility. Will voters believe in Labour's promises? Look at the SNP now. Earlier this week, John Swinney outlined the key points of the SNP's manifesto, which also focused on energy bills. SNP's plan is to deliver a so-called social tariff, cutting bills for a lot of the population to be funded through general taxation and also from profits of the oil and gas companies. This tariff would also cover other essential services such as broadband connectivity. Mr. Swinney pointed out that many services, including some from your local council, are delivered by the internet, so it's important that people are able to get low-cost access. Details are not out yet, but as we prepared this show, Andrew Bartlett of Advice Direct Scotland was pleased that the need for a social energy tariff was moving up the political agenda. You can read more about social energy tariffs on Fuelpoverypanel.scot, and we'll place a link to that below. Incidentally, we at News for Scotland welcome new viewers. Thanks for joining us. We began making these videos just in April on a shoestring budget, and we hope to expand with the help of our viewers. If you want to get an update when we have a new video out, then please click on that subscribe button, which you should find on the bottom right, and we'll tell you whenever we have new shows ready. Also, if you can spare the price of a cup of coffee, it would be great if you could chip in a couple of pounds to our crowdfunder. Again, you'll see a link to that below. Now, let's look again at the battleground between the SNP and Labour in Scotland. Remember, we now have 57 MPs, so if either party wins 29, they can say they've won the Scottish election. Let's look at the figures for recent years. SNP's dominance, as you can see, is a very recent event. It's only 10 years ago when Labour was dominant in Scotland, but the two completely flipped. So the voting here is very volatile. Is it going to flip back again? Opinion polls are equally volatile and don't really give us any clue. When John Swinney took over as party leader just a few weeks ago, Labour led the SNP by 10 points. Later into this campaign, John Swinney cut that Labour lead to 4%, and recently several polls have placed Labour and the SNP neck and neck. In fact, one or two have actually put the SNP ahead. But there still could be a landslide for either party, because the first past the post voting system favours the party that gets slightly ahead. Also, in the Central Belt, there's many SNP seats where Labour came second last time. So voters in those seats have to choose between the two narratives. The fate of the country depends on you. Do people support the Labour view that they can be an effective part of this change sweeping the whole of the UK? Will that be convincing with Labour's fiscal conservativeness? On the other hand, John Swinney for Labour, in his Stornoway speech, placed the SNP firmly on left-of-centre's social democratic territory, asking voters to support extra public spending even if there has to be slightly higher taxes on those who are more able to afford them. There are three other things that the SNP can say. First of all, they're the only genuine party who wants to reverse Brexit. Secondly, they can attack Labour on NHS privatisation. And thirdly, independence is still polling in the high 40s. If Swinney can get the independence vote out, then Labour may not in fact win all those central belt marginals at all. Labour just this week, incidentally, have begun to talk about new negotiations with the EU. They're not going to reverse Brexit, of course, but they could start to move policy in a more pro-European direction. Will this weaken the SNP's independence in Europe argument? Well, that remains to be seen. Labour, however, do seem to have weakened their commitment to a fully public health service, dropping the phrase, the NHS is not for sale, from its manifesto. Wes Streeting, a Labour politician in England, who will probably be the health chancellor under Starmer, has been quoted saying that Labour will open the door to private investment. So with 2 weeks to go, a Scottish winner is impossible to predict, so we're not going to. Scottish voters have some thinking to do. Right, thanks for watching this video, and we'll be back soon with more news for Scotland.